What I would like to focus on today, as you will see, is on the concept of privacy and how privacy may justify that taxes play a role in protecting informational privacy as we live now in. And therefore, although we are all discussing the meaning of digital revolution, the consequences for state sovereignty, how the OECD has been handling this, also fair allocation of taxing rights, I will claim that privacy also plays a major role. The next slide, please, Eduardo. If we briefly look at the OECD approach in the recent 20 years, not so recent anymore, we will see that there is a trend, or at least it is one of the trends, to deny the impact of the digital economy on the allocation of taxing rights, and therefore on the nexus that we choose for our international tax system. And this is connected, according to my interpretation, to the difficulty in defining digital economy and in finding elements that are connected to state boundaries, to physical or geographical state boundaries. However, it can also be seen in all the documentation, in all the reports, that the protection of data and to foster a globalized internet model has been underlying all these reports and all the research also held by the OECD and, of course, in academia. And it has been there was an awareness since the beginning that the source state would be losing its taxing rights. The OECD was not fully convinced about it, but the issue was raised very early in the Ottawa conference, for example. But taking it all into attention, we could conclude that there has been some myopic phenomenon about the future, as there has been no decision for a long time, although, of course, we now have the pillars 1 and 2, or at least pillar 1 for our purpose, and we will soon have a new discussion or new developments on the topic. The next slide, please, Eduardo. As we all know, in recent years, we have been discussing whether we should have a ring-fence solution or what we would call a long-term solution without ring-fence, because the digital economy is everywhere, and therefore there would be no need, and it would not be adequate to ring-fence the economy. What I am suggesting today is the opposite. I am suggesting that ring-fence is needed for data knowledge and data mining as a specific business model. This specific business model, as the most profitable business model currently, deserves specific tax treatment because of the reduction and violations of our privacy, informational privacy. And also, we can claim that there is exchange of utilities between social network sites and users, and moreover, that the individual consent is insufficient to protect our privacy, even in the case of the European Union member states where we have a data protection regulation. So this is not really conflicting with what we call a long-term solution, where market states should be granted taxing rights in respect of any business model. The thing is that I claim that a specific approach towards data knowledge and data mining is necessary in order to protect our privacy rights. The next slide, please, Eduardo. So what is privacy? The meaning of privacy has been discussed in a multidisciplinary context by anthropology, psychology, and many other social sciences. And it is put forward as a basic human necessity. In the current context of social network sites and other internet sites, the meaning of privacy allows for knowledge discovery and data mining. And this also has now been the object of broad multidisciplinary research for over 15 years, I would say now. And we can contend that privacy is, in this context, also a condition to create self-identity and therefore self-determination in the modern liberal state. It is necessary for the undisturbed growth of the self, of its autonomy, identity, and integrity, and free participation in the public sphere. It has also to be distinguished from secrecy, the latter meaning to block or hide any type of information. The next slide, please, Dourado. So we could say that privacy is a corollary to the transformation of the public sphere, where in the Habermasian concept of validity of law, we need that public sphere, and this is also a condition for the rule of law. So public sphere depends on the communication among self-determined individuals. This exchange of opinions and the formation of the public discourse in liberal societies also occurs in the communicative space of the public sphere. But for this, we need, and I'm insisting on this point, self-determined individuals. The next slide, please, Eduardo. Therefore, when there are violations of privacy, these violations have destructive or disruptive effects on the integrity of the human being and some activities, on the aforementioned self-determination and participation in the also aforementioned public sphere discourse. Let me insist that the public sphere discourse, I am mentioning it as a condition for us to live in a liberal democratic society. So violations of informational privacy, which has also become global, eliminates the concepts of personal space and territorial privacy. Next slide, please, Eduardo. What are the problems that have been identified? There is a catalog, there is some consensus among the research, and these problems are related to information collection, leading to surveillance and interrogation problems, information processing, which includes aggregation, analysis, identification, insecurity, secondary use and exclusion, dissemination, leading to the breach of confidentiality, disclosure, exposure, blackmail, appropriation, distortion, and intrusion and interference with personal decisions. Next slide, please, Eduardo. This means that SNS and internet pose a big challenge to the state. On the one hand, it is important that users and business structures are identified in order to avoid criminal behavior and breaches to fundamental rights achieved by anonymity and opaque structures in business. But on the other hand, it's also important to protect privacy, as I tried to briefly explain, since this is held as a basic human necessity and it is legally protected in some liberal states and jurisdictions. Next slide, please, Eduardo. It's also, it's now consensual that in the pre-web world, individuals and groups had more or less effective means to control or regulate the level of their desired privacy. This can be seen in circles, different and concentric circles of intimacy, where we each of us, and also in groups, not only individually, but also within groups, we can set up, and we do set up, different levels of intimacy. Currently, the breach of privacy occurs at two levels, at the SNS friends level and at the level of the owners of the website. And it is the latter level that may justify specific taxation. In any case, ongoing research on our behavior has shown that SNS users either are not fully aware of the dimension of privacy issues, or at least most of them ignore that SNS sell their data for data knowledge and data mining purposes. So there is some kind of myopic effect where we could say that the immediate utilities that the immediate benefits that we get from using internet or SNS are more important for us, are overvalued in contrast to the disadvantages that surveillance can cause us potentially in the future. It seems that we ignore or tend to ignore these potential future disadvantages. Next slide, please, Eduardo. When we then look at the so-called long-term solution, where market states would be granted taxing rights in respect of any business model, it seems that multi-sided business is not specifically covered, or at least taxation of multi-sided business with the purpose of also protecting our privacy will not be targeted. And therefore, what I claim is that our discussion in terms of value creation, in order to justify taxation by market states, is not valid, is not necessary, is not the one that we should put forward. Instead, we should focus on the need to protect privacy, and therefore any specific taxes on data knowledge and mining would play a regulatory role in this respect. And the issue is that the regulatory role is not only associated with the protection of each individual, but it is fundamentally related to protecting liberal societies and the aforementioned public sphere. Next slide, please, Eduardo. As we know, we have in Europe several legal responses for data protection, and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, as well as the TFEU, acknowledge data protection as a right on its own. It's distinct from privacy rights. It's a way to control what has been called surveillance capitalism. And in this context, privacy rights are an expression of freedom and dignity of the individual, ranging from property rights to body security, and can be seen, as I mentioned before, also as a condition to the development of our personality. Next slide, please, Eduardo. So we can look at data protection in either a narrower, more individualistic, or a broader social perspective. And this approach may, of course, face the same objections as privacy rights. And how distinct data protection is from other privacy rights depends on the framing. It is more accurate to argue that data protection is a condition to protect privacy rights and the limit to information because it is a condition to avoid harmful intrusions in the development of personality and ultimately to protect democracy. Next slide, please, Eduardo. In this context, also, I claim that individual consent for the collection and processing of personal data, although being a key concept in the EU regulation, it is insufficient because of this myopic phenomenon that I mentioned before. Data protection, to a certain extent, as we have it now, forces transparency of the processing of personal data. The purpose is to enable full control of the data by the subjects, but it doesn't work properly in the sense that it's insufficient. The next slide, please, Eduardo. As counter-arguments, we could claim that there is no risk in terms of surveillance capitalism because our personal data, individual considered, have no meaning. We are converted into digits. Therefore, when there is the data knowledge and mining activities, because we are converted in digits, then our identities are not at risk. This argument could then prove that we are in face of a capitalism of algorithms, but there is no risk in terms of surveillance, and there is no risk for our democracy. There are other arguments according to which the technological giants have no purpose to govern the world, and therefore this is not a risk for democracy. And instead, what we would face is a conversion of the vertical power society that we used to have into a horizontal net controlled by ourselves as consumers. However, I claim that this could be true if we would be sure that our democracies and liberal systems would not be menaced, would be protected forever. And the issue is that nowadays we have several internet models that are competing, and only one of them is a liberal model. The next slide, please. So when we talk about algorithms and a horizontal net, and so this new kind of society, we are assuming that all states in the world are liberal states, and that the global open internet is the only model, and that will not be a challenge to this model. And the question is the opposite, and the claim is the opposite. There are illiberal tendencies, and in autocratic regimes, personal data are surveilled, and data knowledge and mining can be targeted to the priorities elected by the regimes. Also, for example, in the current COVID context, there may be also some trends in liberal societies to increase this surveillance as if a new opportunity is showing up. The next slide, please, Eduardo. And I think should be the last, or we are reaching. So as I said, I think that the explicit consent also under the European Protection Data Regulation is insufficient, and we would need a specific text. An example is the European Commission proposal for specific taxation of multi-sided business, and these texts can play a regulatory role in the broad sense, or at least in ways that can be researched upon and discussed upon. And I think that's all, Eduardo. Not sure if I have any other slides, but my message is there, so I could finish here. Let's finish here.